Hi, today I'm very happy to say that we're going to have a chat with Tom Davis, main man with Tom Davis and the Bluebirds, um, who recently were nominated for Emerging Blues Act. And Tom twice has been nominated for Young Blues Artist. So this seems like a really good time to catch up with Tom with his new album soon to be released. Hi, Tom. How's things?
I'm not bad. How is yourself?
Yeah, pretty good. Pretty good.
Good.
I must say I've been really enjoying the new album. I think it's due out in early April, isn't it?
Yeah, April 10th. Yeah,
April 10th.
it's obviously uh our first album. I think we've all come to sort of the senses that we're all very happy with it, and we're hoping and we're looking forward to seeing it. How people, if they like it or not.
Yeah. Well, I have to say I've been listening to it and I really enjoy it. And I think one of the sort of things that springs to mind to ask you is, I mean, I think we mentioned, you're like a young blues artist. So how did a young man get the blues?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, if I'm totally honest, I don't remember the exact moment. But what I do remember is, and I like to think I'm probably not alone in this. But what really got me to begin with, in terms of, because obviously blues is such a huge genre. I'm not ashamed to say that really my first love of it came from the British stuff.
Hmm.
Like the 60s stuff. You've got, I mean, my some of my favorite guitar players still, and Peter Green and like Cream era Clapton, and and obviously the Jeff Beck, who, as probably most people are aware, evolved so far beyond. I think definitely keeping the roots within that music. But I think, I mean, if you listen to, I mean, I always sort of say to people, there's such a huge difference from, if you think, like Truth, which was obviously the first, as far as I'm aware, was the first Jeff Beck album with the Jeff Beck group. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yeah,
Jeff
yeah,
Beck group.
Jeff Beck.
Yeah. And then obviously, if you kind of think from there, he sort of, obviously in that era, he still had like sort of Beckola and things like that, which is another great album, Spanish Boots and all that sort of stuff, which has obviously been a huge influence on myself, especially Truth, because that was sort of the first kind of, because obviously I always wanted to get into Jeff Beck, and I think maybe my thing was, because like I say, there's so much of it. I kind of started with some of his later works, which obviously still appreciated it hugely on a musical level. But I
Yeah.
think if you kind of go from, say, I don't know, like just Disraeli Gears or Mr. Wonderful, which was one of the early Fleetwood Mac,
Really.
Peter Green
Yeah.
albums, it's quite a huge jump musically speaking. So I kind of went back to it, I think, a couple of years later. And when I really got into Jeff Beck, it was definitely on that Truth album with, things like Blues Deluxe.
Yes.
And, that, because I think that I don't know for sure, but I can only surmise from when I've listened to it at obviously high volumes, you can sort of hear the kind of the crowd in the back. So I think, as far as I'm aware, some of it was recorded live. I don't know
So too.
yeah, but no, that was a huge thing. I mean, and obviously, it probably, I know it sounds awful to say, but I really started getting into the later Jeff Beck. So I guess from, was it Blow by Blow that had "'Cause We Ended as Lovers" on it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then obviously The Wired, I think was the album after, right? Something like that. And then obviously kind of the later stuff. And again, one of my huge discoveries for me was Live at Ronnie Scott's
Right.
live album, which is obviously, I think the first track I heard on that was, which I always tell people about because it just blew me away when I heard it. It was Footsteps, because because I don't know if you've seen that on YouTube or whatever, but I remember watching that because he takes the slide off his finger, doesn't he? And then he sort of puts
Mm.
it on like the strings and does all those crazy like harmonic things with it. I was just like, oh,
Yeah,
that's
I remember
amazing,
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but no, just, but like I say, all that sort of music, going back to what I was saying about the the British stuff, I mean, I think probably for me, Peter Green was probably the biggest influence. Not to diminish the others, of course, but I think probably for me starting out, definitely learning to play this sort of stuff. I mean, the first blues song I learned was "Need Your Love So Bad," which of course is not a Peter Green song, but it's obviously his version of it, you know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, no, huge influence. And I still love, I still listen to all those albums now, like them Play On. I think is probably my
Yeah.
favorite.
Yeah.
I
I
mean, when
think
you've
that's my
got,
favourite. I think that's my
yeah, I
favourite
mean,
Fleetwood Mac album.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, obviously, on a visual basis, the front cover is awesome. You know, obviously, I know that doesn't play into the musical side of it, but that kind of it's almost like
I
a
think
horse with,
more
like, someone
so.
ride on the back of it.
I think in those days when those things were first being released, it was much more like the whole package, the sleeve work and
Yeah.
everything that was the whole package. It's interesting you Peter Green, and obviously you do the track. What is it called? For Greeny.
Yeah, Blues for Greeny, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think listening to the album, um, the sort of Peter Green influence is the one that comes through
Mm.
most clearly. I think.
Well, I'm really happy you said that because I think I've probably worn that one out the amount of times I've listened to it. And obviously, I guess the thing is I think I was watching an interview of Warren Haynes once where he was basically talking about how, you know, even if you're not maybe consciously practicing some of this stuff, I think the influence and the way that people play, I'm pretty sure he was talking about sort of like, you know, John Coltrane and things like that. 'Cause
Yeah,
he, obviously, I think there was an album of Coltrane's of like Blue Train,
Blue Train. Yeah,
you know, which obviously had all the great sort of classic jazz musicians on there. But I think because obviously that was the stuff. I'm sorry if I get this wrong, but from my recollection at least, he was basically saying obviously he, you know, not being a, I guess what you would consider a jazz guitarist, jazz
right.
musician, whatever. He basically said, you know, but that music still really inspired him, kind of almost internally influenced him. Maybe even not about him realizing it, you know. And I think maybe obviously where I put the hours in and was kind of like transcribing Peter Green stuff, but I think also kind of just the vibe of the music, particularly then play on and the arrangements and sort of the ways of doing things, I think probably was more like a thing I wasn't aware I was taking that stuff in until I kind of came to start writing the music and things like that, you know. But
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, so I mean, you obviously you mentioned Jeff Beck with those early albums, and the thing I find interesting with those early Jeff Beck, not the Jeff Beck band albums, but things like Wired and the stuff that came after.
Mm,
He's one of the few kind of guys who released what were pretty much fully instrumental albums. I think
yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that I can actually sit and listen to the whole album
Yeah, I know what you
and
mean because you
enjoy.
don't. I think, yeah, and I know. I know exactly what you mean. I think because I guess I can probably only talk about this maybe from like a guitar player point of view. But I always, you know, and to be honest, you know, I've always had, I think, that really strong appreciation, like we were saying about jazz music. That's always
Right.
been, particularly in the last couple of years, it sort of became quite a big part of like my inspirational kind of thing. Again, obviously, if you think a lot of that music, I mean, you have obviously some phenomenal jazz guitar players, but I guess
Yeah.
if you think about the way they play versus how a blues player would play, there isn't like a lot of bending, is there? You know, it's
No.
kind of, I think, and that's kind of, I maybe might be going off the point slightly, but when I got into people like Robin Ford, it was kind of like it was taking the sounds of jazz, right? But sort of inflicting it with that sort of that blues flavor, so it didn't feel completely alien to me. So I sort of know what you mean in the sense it's quite overwhelming, isn't it? When
Yes. Yeah.
you hear something that's so different, and it's kind of, you know, I'm of the opinion personally. I think sort of, I don't know, I don't honestly completely know if I'm totally honest, but from some people I've sort of spoken to over the last couple of years, you know, I think there's so much of a thing with music now that people wanna be able to, like, digest it all in one thing, and they don't wanna have to sort of keep listening. I think with some people, it's very much like a surface level thing, whereas it's kinda like, like that or I don't like it." And I feel like that whole art of kind of, and like, again, I wouldn't know as much as some people would, obviously, but, I feel like it's good to have to sort of wanna train your ear a
Yeah,
little bit
definitely. Yeah.
because it makes you, especially from my point of view when you're kind of trying to write songs, because you can't, it's that sort of term, isn't it? You can't capture lightning in a bottle or something like that. You kind of have to, I'm very aware, like once this is done, that's done now. You don't want to have to spend the next sort of 30 years of your career trying to repackage the same thing, you know? So
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
good to evolve, you know?
Absolutely. It's very true. And I think that reflects probably how life is generally these days, isn't it? That it's very
Yeah.
much instant. I mean, I find I'm kind of old school and I like to put an album on and listen to a whole album.
Yes.
Um,
Absolutely.
and I think when you do that, you often you you've bought the album because you've heard a piece of music that you like, or
Mm,
you know you like the artist. And I think often when you first play an album, there's a track or a couple of tracks that stand out, and you think, oh yeah, they're my favourite tracks. But the more often you play the album, that can
yeah,
often change, and another track kind of emerges. The
yeah,
more often you
absolutely.
hear
Well,
it,
yeah, well, yeah, and it's an excellent point because I know we've talked about it already, but everyone who knows me will probably be saying if they ever hear this, it's like, oh God, he's gone on about Peter Green again. But I think, but going back to them play on, it's kind of like, I mean, obviously I wasn't around at the time that it came out, but I can only sort of surmise by, I guess, sort of songs that you hear people play, in like sort of on the circuit or whatever. Generally speaking, I'm not saying that's it across the park, but generally speaking, well, what do you hear? You hear "Oh Well,"
yeah,
you hear "Green Manalishi," you know.
yeah,
We're certainly guilty of that. We've been doing that one recently because it's a great, great song. But the ones that people forget about, I'm only rattling them off the top of my head. But do you remember that track, "Coming Your Way"? It was,
yeah,
I think, the first one on the album because it's that one that's got that sort of percussion-y thing,
mhm,
right?
yeah,
Almost like you can kind of hear in that song, it's kind of almost where like Santana, because obviously he was a big Peter Green fan.
yeah,
Definitely that kind of almost Latin-y sort of
yeah, yeah. You forget about him.
percussion and
Yeah,
stuff. Yeah, and then obviously one of my other favorite tracks on that album was, do you remember "Without You"?
hmm,
Yeah, "Without You," "Showbiz Blues," "Rattlesnake Shape," all that stuff. Just
yeah. So much
the
good
whole
stuff,
album.
isn't there?
Yeah, and I know "Well" Part Two. Or, like we said about instrumental music, that whole piece is instrumental, and the way that it kind of blends from like "Oh Well" Part One to Part Two to "Manalishi" and then "World in Harmony." It's great.
Yeah,
Absolutely brilliant.
yeah. It's a good point, I think, that you make about covers as well, because, some tracks, for whatever reason, become so covered that you
Mm,
almost you don't go and listen to the original again because you've
yeah,
become a bit jaded
yeah.
with the track, if that
Yeah,
makes
it's
sense.
no, totally. Well, it's kind of, and I think this is something I remember hearing Joe Bonamassa say when he was putting together. Because actually, and this is interestingly enough, the album that really sold me on, because I can remember when I first started listening to him, and obviously from a guitar player. He's probably one of my biggest influences. Certainly, I mean, if you think about all that crazy like Eric Johnson stuff that he does and all that kind of, I absolutely love. I remember hearing that for the first time and thinking, I've got to learn how to do that, and I sort of semi butcher it now, but I'm sort of getting a bit better at it all the time. But anyway, but what I was going to say was, yeah, and it does lead on to the point. There was a live album he did a couple of years ago. I think it was like 2016 or something like that. This was the one. Do you remember Live at the Greek Theatre?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically it was like 3 sets, wasn't it? Because he did like the Freddie King stuff, then the Albert King, and then he obviously finished it off with BB King. 'Cause obviously he had that kind of connection from BB King, didn't he, when he was
Yeah.
younger?
When he was little. Yeah.
But I think one of the best things, and because he did a few, didn't he? Because he did like that Muddy Wolf, which was the one he did like the Howlin' Wolf
He
and
did
Muddy
that.
Waters
Yeah.
one. There was the Greek Theatre one, which was the one in the middle, and then the last one was like the British blues explosion, right? And it was like Beck and Clapton and all that stuff. But anyway, but going back to my point, well, your point really, it's kind of like I remember him saying something about those shows, and it was sort of like it's paying tribute, but without playing the hits.
Yes.
It's that sort of mentality of, and I think it's a great thing too, because particularly me, like I was saying earlier, I really got into like Freddie King, and Albert King through the kind of the covers of the British artists, right?
Yeah.
So obviously hearing kind of, and like I said, Bonamassa being a huge influence in that, but him sort of shining the light. I mean, obviously I knew the songs like Thriller's Gone and Sweet Little Angel and things like that. And obviously for Freddie King, I knew Hideaway and I knew The Stumble and all that
Mm.
stuff. But I think him almost shining the light on some of the lesser known
On the
ones,
lesser ones. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was kind of like a bit eye opening. And then when you go back and you hear, I mean, I'm sort of very, it's very satisfying for me to say that sort of in our sort of set at the moment when we play live, and particularly when we play with our, because on the album we had Mr. Ray Drury playing keys, fantastic keys player, but obviously, especially when he comes to play with us, you can sort of play some of those songs, like breaking up someone's home, and I'll play the blues for you and things like that. And I'd sort of, like I said, I knew the more popular ones, but definitely when I heard kind of the lesser known ones, I was like, oh, okay, well, I need to go and do some more research into this, clearly. But no,
Yeah,
I mean, I don't think it matters how you get there. I think it's just getting there, if that makes sense.
I was impressed that you covered "Wreck My Home," the whole Wolf
But
track.
yeah, You're Gonna Wreck My Life. Yeah, the Howlin' Wolf
"Wreck My
track.
Life,"
Yeah,
sorry, yeah, because
yeah.
that's one of my favourite Wolf tracks.
Really? Yeah,
The thing is, like we said earlier, most people, they do like Killing Floor or, Smokestack
yeah,
Lightning,
yeah.
which are more obvious choices. And you could have easily gone down that route and easily covered one of those. But
Mm.
yeah, I was really impressed with what you chose.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you very much. But and for me, obviously, if people haven't listened to it, it's kind of hard to describe. But obviously, you have. I mean, it would be a fair description to say it's very different to the original.
Yeah,
You know, but but and it's an interesting point because I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about being into the the early like the British stuff to begin with because I think because I think you kind of have to really get the stuff and then sort of pull it apart and then kind of go, okay, what is kind of the general flavour of the song? Because it's a great song to begin with, but I sort of thought it would be a bit of a bit cheap or a bit of a cop out to sort of go, oh, let's just do it as per
yeah,
whatever the original was,
yeah, but yeah,
kind
and
of
there's no point
how do
doing that
we?
really.
Yeah, absolutely, and the thing is that, and what really made me think about putting together that sort of arrangement for it, and it's you know, it's no lie, I'm a big Led Zeppelin fan, particularly Led Zeppelin 1.
Yeah,
That's always been my favourite Led Zeppelin album. Um, just because of how raw it is, and it really captures it's kind of like blues on 10.
yeah,
It's kind of, so when I can remember putting it together and sort of being like, okay, well, what can we do with it? What is, because obviously you start off by learning the song. You got to have like some sort of idea as to where it's going. I was kind of like, okay, well, if I was trying to sort of do like a kind of a rework of this, what would I want it to be like? And it was kind of, well, obviously you have to kind of throw the sort of the Led Zeppelin kind of playbook at it a little bit,
yeah,
and obviously you kind of arrive because it's got a few different sections to it, but really that's inspired by things like there's a I don't know how well you remember it, but there's like that sort of section just before it goes in, so that slightly kind of almost kind of rock and roll section of like it's just the guitar by itself, right?
yeah.
And for me, that's when I sort of thought about that, it's like that's just Heartbreaker. Like the track off Zeppelin 2, when sort of the band stop and Jimmy Page just sort of goes off on one, and it's kind of like, okay, well,
I think
throw that in there.
Wolf himself actually recorded a few versions of it over the years.
Yeah, no,
The first version, I think, was came out in something like 1954 with a
yeah,
slightly different title.
yes, yeah, because it was "You Gonna Wreck My Life," but it was a reference in the lyric, wasn't it? I don't remember
Yeah,
what it was.
I
I'll
can't
have to
quite
check that
remember the
out,
title, but
but I know what you mean now. Yeah.
yeah, with a guy called Lee Cooper, I think, was a guitar player
Mm.
on that very first version. And then I think I don't know if he recorded a version with Herbert Summerlin on guitar. I'm sure he must have done. Who of course is another fabulous guitar player.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I'd have to go out and check those out. But really, it was kind of like, it was almost by chance, really, because I was sort of thinking, okay, well, it would be great to have like an old, like Howlin' Wolf song
Yeah,
on there, but sort of done in our way. And then just by chance, I think it was like half an hour later when I was like researching sort of some of I don't want to say it's like a complete back catalogue one because it clearly isn't, but it's obviously the one, like you say, it's not Killing Floor, is it? And it's not
no,
kind of that
exactly.
sort of, so I thought obviously fate was sort of being like, this is the one you want. So
Yeah,
so
yeah,
that's kind of how it came
nice.
to be. Yeah.
And it's great because, the thing is, like, people will listen to the album who aren't familiar with that track, and hopefully
Mm.
they'll go, oh, yeah, this is really good. And they might kind of delve a bit deeper into the Wolfsback catalogue as well. So,
Absolutely, yeah, and what I've always been a big fan of Howlin' Wolf, and again I think but going back to sort of like Zeppelin, that I mean, obviously, kind of one of my introductions to it was Lemon Song, which is basically Killing Floor, right? Like halfway through, and it does that breakdown. It's basically just the riff from Killing Floor, So,
yeah, yeah,
but
it's
it's
interesting.
funny.
I mean, I obviously I'm older, and I was listening to those bands like Zeppelin, and Cream, and the Rolling Stones were another huge influence in John Mayall.
Mm,
And, listening to them and reading interviews by them, where they were referencing people like Wolf and Muddy Waters and stuff, and then thinking, oh, I better check this out. And
absolutely. Yeah.
going back and then, discovering, first of all, those people, and then, delving a bit deeper and discovering more obscure blues players.
Mm. Yes.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
the
yeah.
blues has that sort of tradition, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's again, I don't want to sort of speak for everyone, but sort of my opinion, if you like, and there might be others that share the same opinion. Is it's kind of like it's very much. I feel that it's important to kind of it's that thing I was saying about Bonamassa is like you want to sort of pay tribute, if you like, to the ones that came before, because obviously if they weren't a thing, we wouldn't have had if Buddy Guy wasn't a thing, we wouldn't have had Clapton. Because
Right.
I remember, it's like what's that folk festival of the blues, the one
Mm.
that Clapton sort of says it was very a big thing. We obviously had like Howlin' Wolf and all that on stage, but then Buddy Guy came out because that's obviously when he was starting,
Yeah.
and then obviously he came out and just destroyed everyone.
Yeah.
So but it's important, I think, but I also feel I feel like where because it's like I was saying earlier, it's such a huge genre of music, and it very much, I feel it's sort of, it's not really a self-contained thing.
No.
It
No.
doesn't feel like, you can sort of say, well, that's blues, because it's like, yeah, okay, there might be like a foundational thing there, but then it feels like there's so much stuff now. And I think that's one of the great things actually about sort of the age we live in now, which I've sort of often thought about really, is where I think, every decade, kind of the needle of kind of the pinnacle, like the Mount Olympus of guitar player, has sort of moved incrementally up. So if you think kind of in the sort of 60s, you had obviously people like Clapton coming out, and then the next, and obviously you had like Hendrix and all that, and they were obviously just huge, you know,
Yeah.
immovable forces of nature, really, and then obviously if you think jump forward a sort of a decade or two, you have obviously Eddie Van Halen coming out, and he kind of
Yeah.
just completely changes the rule book again,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
obviously kind of in and within all of that, like I said earlier, to me, Eric Johnson was a huge one,
Yeah.
like in a way, I know maybe people wouldn't consider him a blues guitar player, but I feel like obviously if you've watched interviews with him, you know that he was a huge Clapton fan to the point where early in his career, he was very much slated for being someone who just played Clapton licks. But I mean, but to someone, to maybe like the average listener, if you like, you'd think, well, how does something like, I don't know, Clapton's solo on Spoonful or the live version of Crossroads at the album, on the Wheels of Fire album, go to something like I don't know, Cliffs of Dover, anything Eric Johnson, but it's the translation, isn't it, from kind of point A to B,
Yeah.
um, and then obviously in the modern, and then in that 80s sort of period, obviously beforehand. But if you think, but when they really came to fruition, I guess, you had people like Robin Ford that were kind of injecting that jazz kind of thing into the
Jazz
blues,
side of it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously he wasn't the only one, but he was definitely one for me, um, who kind of sort of really changed the way I look at guitar.
Mm.
And then it kind of goes on and on and on. And I feel like that's one thing where I feel like I have maybe a slightly different opinion to some, because, I'm not, obviously, no one is wrong. That's the beauty of music, isn't it? But I think, I feel it's a shame to sort of to say, oh, well, blues is this, and then kind of do that for the next like 30, 40 years, rather than being like, and like I said about Jeff Beck, he was someone who was always,
Mm.
working on, not just as a musician, but if you think about, like I said, the huge jump in the type of music from something like Truth to something like Blow by Blow, or
Yeah.
any of those kind of later Jeff Beck, or like, oh, here you go, the Guitar Shop album,
Mhm.
which is one of my favourites. That's kind of when he changed again. That was what, like late 80s, something like that.
Yeah. And then you listen to, the Beck Boogie album,
Yeah. Mm.
and stuff like that, where it was,
Yeah,
a bit heavier and
yeah, definitely. Well, like I said, but really my point being is I feel like it's important to kind of have not just the respect, but just sort of to keep the kind of the music of those who came before alive, and that means sort of maybe not just playing the kind of the hits, if you like,
no,
but sort of doing like, keeping the other stuff, and then obviously kind of, but then it's kind of like, okay, well, you can do that, that's great, but what can you offer? You know, what's kind of your stamp on it, if you like, you know, because at the end of the day, that's kind of how people are unique, right? You know,
definitely,
you
definitely.
gotta have your own thing.
It's interesting because obviously as a guitar player, and I can definitely feel the Peter Green influence in there, and some of the other people that you've mentioned.
Mm,
And it's still quite interesting that a lot of that stuff was kind of mid-60s, which is when I think about it, it's a long, long way away from where you are now.
mm.
Lyrically, a lot of the songs you've written, I think that there's a lot of lyrics I hear in your writing, which I think is very mature for a guy of your
Thank you.
age. It's kind of steeped in the mythology around the Delta.
Yeah, yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah,
Yeah, which is another kind of interesting sort of contrast, but in a good way, you know.
yeah, yeah.
Apart from being influenced by those early '60s guys,
Mm,
it I get the sense that from there you went somewhere else, and lyrically you
mm.
were inspired by a whole different set of people, maybe.
It's a good question, you know, because I feel like you say there is like a certain, whether you believe in that or not, I guess is the
Yeah.
question. But I think there's like that certain mythology to it. So I think, yeah, you've sort of hit the nail on the head there, I guess. Yeah, and to me, I feel like it was more about, because I guess I don't know if I'm alone in thinking this, but it's kind of like the
Mm.
sound of something. You know, like take what's one of the tracks on the album? Take like, I don't know, like Alone in the Delta or something like that, where it's kind of
Yeah.
very much kind of steeped in that kind of Delta-esque kind of that style. But you know, if I'm totally honest, I don't really remember sort of it being a conscious decision to
Right.
obviously have the lyrics. I do remember sort of thinking, because I wanted to do something like my idea for the album originally. So this is probably going back just over a year now. I was sort of like, wouldn't it be cool if I could sort of try and capture all my influences
Mm.
on, or well, not that I want to say all, because obviously you kind of find new stuff all the time, don't you? But most of my influences kind of on one album, and to me that was kind of like the sound of like the Delta stuff. So to me, like, you know, the resonator guitar and sort of the slide and the
Oh,
different
yeah.
tunings on the guitar and things like that. So I thought, you know, so my idea really for those sort of songs was kind of like, how do we kind of take almost two ends of the spectrum of blues music onto one thing? And to me, I guess where it started back in the Delta, you know, with like Robert Johnson and
Mhm.
Sonny Boy Williamson, you know,
Yeah.
and then kind of almost like I'll go on about it again, but sort of almost more from that at the opposite end of something like with Led Zeppelin, you
Yeah.
know. So, and then obviously I'm a huge Ry Cooder fan as
Mhm.
well, you know. So to me, not, and I'm not, you know, I pride myself because I'm not a very good slide player. It's something that I've only really got into in the last 2 years, maybe, because it just, you know, when you kind of watch people like Ry Cooder, and then by the modern kind of extension of that being like Derek Trucks and
Yeah.
all those kind of guys, and I'm just like, well, the world doesn't need me to offer my, you know, my two pence in that, because I'm not that great at it. But I sort of thought maybe it'd be nice, just because it is a sound, isn't it? You know,
Oh, very much so.
it's a very distinctive sound, and to me, it could be maybe my ignorance, maybe, but that sort of those, like I say, those different tunings, you know, with the slide, it conjures up that, like you say, that sort of mythology almost around
Yeah.
it. Like it definitely takes your ear in your mind into
Yeah.
one
You
space.
definitely you hear the
Yeah.
sound and you visualize that whole kind of that scenery and that whole
Absolutely.
thing.
You know, I guess actually, funny enough, as we were just talking about it, I sort of, it reminded me, because I remember you sort of saying, you know, how did you sort of arrive to that? And I didn't quite know, but one thing that's just sort of popped into my head, literally as we've been speaking about it, is because I can remember Sai, who obviously is a fantastic bass player in the band, because when we were putting the album together, because we sort of thought, well, maybe it's time to do one, and I think we had a couple of prompts from people saying, right, okay, so let's do an album now. So I was like, oh, it's had like a year to write it or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Of size sort of came round, and we were like sat in the front room, and obviously, you know what it's like. It's a complete mess because you had all the guitars everywhere and amps and all the rest of it in this room, you know. and we were just sort of thinking, well, because I had the idea, because I think I just not long bought like a resonator or something like that. It was,
Mm.
something adjacent. And I think I just got into sort of slide playing. Not, again, very, very basic stuff, but it was just kind of, obviously my ear was kind of ready to move on a little bit at that point. And I can remember I can remember Sai sort of saying to me, "It's like, okay," I remember saying to him, "It's like, right, if you give me like an idea or something you can kind of picture in your mind. Like if I played him like the riff or whatever I had, and I was so this would have been Alone on the Delta, and I remember sort of saying, right, if I play this, and we played it to him, I said, right, what does this make you think of? And I can distinctly remember him saying, I can sort of imagine. I know it sounds a bit whatever, but the rain coming down and then going back to the sea, which of course, if
Mm.
you've heard the album, when the rain hits dirt and falls back into the sea,
Yeah,
like the Mississippi River coming back to me, that's like the first line of the song, as far as I'm aware. Don't quote me on that, even though I wrote it. But that's
yeah, that
definitely
makes a
in
lot of
there.
sense.
Yeah. But that's where it came from, and then the rest of the song just sort of just happened, and well, I guess it was obviously meant to be.
Mm.
Because I had Angel in the Mississippi to begin with, and I was kind of like, right, this is the title track for the
Yeah,
album. Because I just thought that's a pretty good name actually, so I was quite proud of myself for that.
yeah.
And um, and I sort of thought, but wouldn't it be cool? And again, I think this kind of goes into like the what we were talking about right at the beginning, was it was kind of like the way that album, you'll buy an album, say for like one or two songs, but then you'll hear the artistry, not just in the rest of the album. But I think importantly, particularly when you're putting an album together, like from a musical point of view, is kind of like, right, what's a good track listing? It's not just about writing the songs,
I,
it's
I
like
was gonna.
what fits together, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
And I've always thought, because Angel Mississippi it's a big song, like, especially so when we were sat in the recording studio recording it, and we literally listened to 7.5 minutes straight of just bass and drums.
yeah.
That's not fun, you know. But no, I always thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool to have like almost like a. Obviously, you can't call it Angel in the Mississippi Part One and Part Two, but that was sort of the thought process to it, you know. So wouldn't it be cool to have like almost like a prologue to the rest of the album, you know?
I think that's really interesting you mentioned about track listing because for me that's such a these days it seems to be such an overlooked skill and art of putting an album together.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the last
Uh,
album I sort of listened to that made me really think, "Oh, they've put a lot of thought into this,"
mm,
was, it might be a surprise to some, I like to think to most it probably won't be, the new David Gilmour album,
mhm.
Fucking Strange.
Yeah,
First of all, it's just a fantastic album. Definitely one of my favourites to come out of the last, was it the 2024, I think it came out? Something like that?
yeah, I guess so, yeah.
Couple of years ago, yeah. But I just thought, but he's always been good at that, though, isn't he? I mean, if you think back to the Pink Floyd stuff, I mean, the way, I know it's probably an overplayed example, but the way that money goes into Us and Them on Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah,
I can remember the first time I heard that, because I mean, I really liked Money, and that was obviously great. And obviously, you have like Time, don't you? And that's
mm,
where it's breathing the air and then Time, isn't it? I think on the album,
yeah.
but
I
that's
just
not
think,
just on that album.
and I know how long, and I've been involved in it with different people, how long, an artist will take to get the running order.
Yeah.
And you start with an idea, you think, well, yeah, I want this to be the opening track, but what follows it? And you might
Mm,
have an idea of, I'd like to end the album with this, but you need to build to it. And
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, that's why I like to listen to whole albums rather than just
Mm,
dip in and out because I think you owe it to the artist as much as anything because they put that album out as a piece of work. That's like getting a book and reading one chapter and
yeah.
not
It's
going
like,
anywhere
well,
else.
yeah, so what with the yeah, yeah, but and it's interesting you mentioned, like, the whole album, and it's that sense, isn't it, of
Mm.
you kind of almost like it builds to something, and it's almost kinda like the last track wants to be like a, like a decent full stop, not just like a
Yeah, exactly.
ellipsis, you know?
Yeah, it's like a piece of artwork. You're not just going to draw paint something in the center of the canvas and leave it all the rest of it blank.
Yeah, yeah,
It's all about
absolutely, yeah,
drawing your eye to a certain place. And I think an album is, to me, is a piece of art. It's something that somebody's created to be listened
yeah,
to as a whole. That's the
yeah,
whole.
totally,
Otherwise,
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, you know, otherwise you'd just put stuff out as singles, wouldn't you?
Well, then, yeah, but also it's just sort of it's incohesive, isn't it?
Mm,
There's not kind of that. I'm not saying albums should have a story, and I guess that kind of works into like I guess more genres maybe than others.
yeah.
And it's obviously, I guess it sort of depends what you're going for, of course. But I think there has to be at least some sort of idea of this is like beginning, this is middle, this is end. You know, because
Yeah.
otherwise it just feels a little bit all over the shop, doesn't it? Really.
Even as basic as having a, you know, a theme that runs through the album, be it, you know,
Mm.
people have like breakup albums, don't they? And, you know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah. There's a few of those about. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, there's
yeah,
a lot of those about.
yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I think it's really interesting. But you know, I just really think that the album you've written is really quite mature. You know, it's in the way it's been constructed and put together. So I hope.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, I do hope so because yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I like you say, it's very easy to fall into that trap, isn't it? And I think the key to it is because if hand on heart, if I'm totally being honest, there was definitely a few of those moments which I'm sort of coughing to now after being beautifully set up by yourself, you know. But yeah, no, I think the thing is, you know, as I think you have to have a bit of both. Like there has to be like a bit of give and take, you know. But I think not just in doing this, but in any musical, well, in life really, but especially in any musical context, as that's what we're talking about. But you know, I think you have to kind of be like, you know, right, I'm playing a song, I'm playing a song, playing a song. I have my little window for how many bars it might be, or whatever chords it is, or whatever the section is, to have a little bit. Because I guess, you know, I don't want to be overly biased because of the instrument I play, but I've always felt like in blues music there is that real sense of it's the obviously you have the voice, you know, like I know I can tell I'm listening to BB King by him singing, you know, and then I guess there's the playing, isn't it? Like there's that one note that he always hits where I know exactly what he's doing. You know, so but I think you've got to serve kind of both masters in that, I suppose. But yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, one on the one hand, you can, yeah. I think you've hit it on the head, though. It's exactly that, isn't it? It's finding the balance between it all, rather than just it being one-sided. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting one, and funnily enough, it's one I don't get asked a lot. So thank you for asking it, because I do think it's important. You know, I don't remember because I feel like sometimes people will kind of they will. I promise I'm getting to the point, but I remember going back a couple of years. So I was probably in the throes of starting to write, you see. So when I went to, because I did do a year at a music institute. This would have been a couple of years ago. And like I said, it does get to my point, but there used to be, I don't remember what it was. I think it was like it was like the songwriting course, right? So there was obviously like the musicianship ones, which is what I did, you see, and then there was the songwriting ones. And I always found that really strange because I sort of thought, how do you teach songwriting? You know, because it's so, you know, it's so one case basis, isn't it? That you know, I mean, I know it sounds a bit, and I by no means put myself in the same bracket of at all. But if you know, I'm pretty sure Paul McCartney and John Lennon didn't have that. You know, it's kind of like they did what worked for them. So to answer your question, it's kind of I've always found having a title for a song works for me, but it depends, of course, because if something's instrumental, which of course there's a little bit of that on the album. I've often found in most cases that the title will come for an instrumental thing after the music, but if it's like a lyric or just like a song of lyrics or whatever you want to define that as, the sort of the titles always comes first because I think it's for me it works. I think because it's kind of having that almost theme, like we were talking earlier. Now, the mythology and the theme of the Delta. I was kind of like, well, I had the name Alone on the Delta. I mean, I obviously had the concept of be cool to have like a intro, but in terms of kind of writing the song, it was like, well, Alone on the Delta sounds like a good name. Angel on the Mississippi, sorry, sounds like a good name. So I thought, here's like my parameters, if you like, and try and work to that. But obviously, one of the instrumental tracks on the album is one called Blues for Greeny, which we were talking about earlier. And really, why I chose that name is obviously, well, it's fairly clear in one aspect because it's a tribute to Peter Green, of course, because like we were saying, a huge influence. You know, there's that kind of that surface level thing. There's also the whole thing. I don't know if you recall, but Gary Moore did an album. I think it was like 2000, and it was quite a few years ago now. Do you remember, there's an album called Blues for Greeny? Right. He's also a huge influence on me. In fact, I sort of say probably my two biggest influences, not necessarily now, but certainly like the appeal when I started playing was probably Peter Green and Gary Moore. They are probably like my two like people that I was like, right, I have to learn how to do that. And then obviously it sort of sprouts out, doesn't it? And you find from him, you'll find him, and then so on and so forth. But it was kind of a tribute almost, I guess, to Gary Moore as well, because obviously he had the album called Blues for Greeny. So yeah, kind of a bit of both. And then it was all, you know, but obviously where it has that kind of that typical kind of Peter Green supernatural sound, like the verses in it, and then it kind of goes into that halftime section. And the idea of that was kind of like if you listen to, because obviously Peter Green to begin with was in the Blues Breakers for the Hard Road album, and they, for me, kind of some of the most pinnacle blues breaker moments are like those real heavy sort of halftime blues, kind of real power sort of sections. So I thought, well, it would be cool to have like kind of the later kind of supernatural sound to it, and then kind of the real heavy blues breaker sounds. So it kind of, to me, encapsulated both sides of the Peter Green thing, you know. And obviously like the ending of the album is a track called Mainland Evil, which is kind of like a finger style sort of resonator kind of delta sort of thing. Yeah, yeah. And you were saying earlier about the importance of having the right order and almost there being like a tail to tail within the album. You know, that to me was always the obvious kind of ender, because it was kind of just that perfect almost coda takes you back up to the top almost, you know. So yeah, but no, but to answer your question, yeah, that's kind of really the idea of it. Yeah. 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 Well, I mean, without sounding too obvious, but that is really, really it, isn't it? It's someone looking for an alibi. But to me, that's kind of like where my other influences kind of inject themselves a little bit, because I've been a lover of JJ Cale as well. So to me, that's kind of always had like kind of connotations of that sort of JJ Cale sort of sound to it, you know. And my introduction to JJ Cale was, I don't know if you remember, but it was a couple, I think it was obviously after he passed away. Eric Clapton put together that, was it Eric Clapton and Friends, wasn't it? Like an appreciation of JJ Cale or something like that. And that was kind of where I came across songs like Magnolia and Occasion Moon, things like that. So, and on purely yeah, and purely on like a songwriting kind of level, I don't know, like we were saying about there's certain sounds that sort of take you into sort of a certain space almost. And to me, when I sort of wrote the riff for it, it was kind of like, well, this sounds a bit not as good, obviously, because I'm no JJ Cale, but it had that real kind of authenticity to it that I feel like it would kind of belong not just on the album, but it was kind of had that vibe to it. So I thought, oh, it'd be, because I've always wanted to do something acoustically like that, so it kind of felt right, you know. Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, and of course, there's I know it's from a film, but there's the Crossroads thing, right? I mean, my introduction to JJ Cale, it's not JJ Cale, Rykuda, sorry, was a Feeling Bad Blues. When I heard that, I was just like, this is just it. Always sort of struck me from you know, I have to preface this, I'm not like that guy who's listened to like everything that anyone's ever done ever, but I feel like I've maybe have, yeah, yeah, they're not, hopefully one day, there's just so much of it, but really it was kind of like there was a few tracks, but I can distinctly remember Feeling Bad Blues was the one where I was like, okay, this for me, it feels like there's that level of ability there, but it doesn't, you know what, like, you know what we were saying earlier, you know, it's kind of like you feel like, I love this kind of resonates with me, particularly as like a musician, but it doesn't feel overwhelming. You know, like we were talking about earlier with like some of the jazz stuff, you know, you get a sense of being overwhelmed sometimes by instrumental music, because there's so much maturity there, and quite a lot of complexity, and you know, and also a big thing to that, of course, is like writing the hooks, because obviously you haven't got lyrics to fall back on, so it's kind of your ability to write a hook, you know. And I just thought, for me, where I sort of was when I heard that for the first time, I just thought that was probably one of the best guitar instrumentals I've heard, and I still think that now. And hence, you know, I started playing slide really, but you know, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there is a, not that I buy into all of the ethereal stuff, but I do believe, I feel like I've heard this somewhere before because I think it's something that my mum told me, I think a couple of years ago, maybe it was a couple of years ago, something like that. And I think she was sort of saying to me, basically, the gist of it is like, I think these songs are kind of out there, but I think but I think it's very much like they fall into your lap when the time's right, and again, I'm not one to maybe believe necessarily all of that sort of stuff, but I think because again, and what better judge would it be for someone who is a musician to go, well, actually, it makes a lot of sense because if you think there's that, which I'm sure I'm not alone with, but it's that thing, isn't there, of if you force something too much, it won't happen, Yeah. 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 Well, absolutely. Well, I can remember this was probably when I was, oh, I don't know. Well, I think I'm like 22 now. So when I was probably 16, 17. So this was probably around the time where I wasn't, I wouldn't, I don't, quite honestly, I don't really now. It's still quite a bit of a pinch yourself sort of description, if you like. But especially so back then, I wasn't a songwriter. I don't consider myself to be, really. But there was this sort of, and I obviously being new to it back then, and not like writing songs, so to speak, but definitely kind of trying to get into the mix of it and sort of starting to experiment because I knew what I wanted to do, but obviously you kind of have to start at some point, don't you? Otherwise you won't. So I sort of thought, well, why not? And I can remember laying in bed, and not that I've ever done, like you were saying, like sort of keep your phone, next to you. Never did anything like that. But where my bedroom is, what used to be my music room was like next door, right? So I remember, I think it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was obviously like watching something or reading something. I still do, but I used to go to bed quite late, so obviously everyone else would be asleep, and obviously 'cause I had all like my amplifiers in the room. So this would be like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and I remember because this is probably when I started. Cause I'm a huge. I love, obviously, like probably most musicians, I love my guitars. But I think around that time, I was really starting to get the bug for like collecting instruments and trying to get as many as possible. And then you realise, oh, where am I going to put them all? But that's what they don't tell you. But I can remember it being like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and I had this almost like we were saying, this sort of like a ethereal thing because it's weird. I don't know if you've ever felt it, but it's sort of it hits you in your brain and your chest, and then it just sort of washes over you like a wave. I don't know if you've ever experienced like anything like that, but it's sort of like it makes you want to sort of sit up, bolt up in bed because it's such a powerful feeling, and it's like. You get that like that sixth sense when something's about to happen, and it can either be when something's bad, but or something good, because obviously at that point you don't know what it is. You just know something's changed. You don't know what it is, but something's changed. Yeah, and I remember sort of, I remember sort of thinking, oh, what is that? Because I remember I don't know, I don't honestly know if I was thinking about anything or anything. I wasn't forcing it. Like I was saying, I wasn't forcing it. But I just had this idea for something. It just popped into my head. I don't know if I ever used it, quite honestly, but I had the idea. So anyway, I sort of, like I said, I was young, so I was still in school, right? And it wasn't a school night, but I think it was late at night. So I sort of crept into my music room, and obviously because I was young, so I still didn't quite appreciate how loud amplifiers were. So I had this. It was, looking back on it now, it was bloody awful. But I had this like Marshall solid state thing, right? It wasn't particularly powerful, but obviously it was loud enough. So I had obviously an electric guitar. I can't remember. I don't even think I have it anymore. But it was obviously one of my old ones, and I sort of plugged it in, and it's that feeling of sort of hitting a chord when you've got something in your head, or hitting like like a phrase on the guitar, or it was something like that. But anyway, I obviously, because I've been practicing earlier that night, and I used to practice it, not so much now, but I used to quite like practicing. I had like all my pedals and all the guitars around me and all the rest of it. So I had the amp up pretty loud, but obviously because I was kind of half asleep, I didn't realise how loud it was. So I hit like this, when you Oh, like, yeah, everyone woke up, and I think I got a bit of a bollocking. Yeah, but no, but I think it's important. I think, going back to what you were saying, I think it's important to act on it, even if nothing comes, because at least you can sort of say, because I've often, yeah, and I sort of, when I was really, because I remember, because me and my mum obviously talk quite a bit, and I remember because we were sort of chatting, I think, like, oh, was it maybe last week, something like that, and then to be honest, a lot of, like, my early stuff, this is, like, before the band or anything like that, this is sort of the period when I used to go out to do open mics and things like that. So I guess, like, every sort of teenager, who has aspirations of being a musician, I used to go out with my acoustic guitar. So this is when I was very, very, very basic players. Not I couldn't do any like lead stuff or anything like that yet, but I was sort of thought, well, I want to do music, but I obviously had to start somewhere. I just sort of blanked all that stuff out because obviously I've been very well, I would consider I've been quite busy the last couple of years, particularly with the band and all that. Obviously, all that stuff I just sort of blocked out. But she was sort of saying to me, "Yeah, you used to come in from school, and then obviously the open mics would be, I think, on like a Tuesday evening, and they would be in a pub that's down the road from us called I think it's the Wyvern." Something like that. And I remember they used to have like an open mic on a Tuesday night. Obviously, I was kind of hell bent on doing it every Tuesday or whenever, or whatever the day was. I can't remember. I think it was a Tuesday. Yeah, no, obviously I've forgotten. But my mum sort of said to me the other day, I used to sort of come in from school and I used to, like I said, my music room was upstairs. I used to sit in my music room for, I don't know, about a couple of hours, something like that. And she said, you either had written a couple of songs. So this is probably when I was getting a bit more comfortable with writing. I mean, they were awful songs, terrible, but they were enough, to get you sort of started. And because like I said, you have to start, don't you? And, and she said, no, but then you'd obviously had like a couple of covers up your belt and then you would go out, well, or rather they would take me there because obviously I couldn't drive, and I would do my set, and it's a joke really because I mean we sort of the way I think of a set now is like 10 songs. Back then it was only like 2, so it was kind of like it was easy, I don't know why I got myself so worked up for it, but no, I used to that I used to live and breathe it, and I still do. But I think obviously, like I was saying, I think sort of it changes, doesn't it? I think you kind of back then you're kind of experimenting, and I knew I wanted to do it. It was kind of, but I think it was that period of when I was still trying to figure out what I wanted to do within it, if that makes sense. Because obviously when you're young, you don't really know. I mean, you've got a pretty good idea, but I don't think you wholeheartedly know what you want to do. But then obviously, but I always had, like I said, that when I started learning to play guitar, my guitar teacher was like, okay, have you ever heard of Peter Green before? And I was like, well, I heard the name, obviously, just by trying to accumulate as much music as possible. And he's like, right, and he put the sheet in front of me for Need Love So Bad, and then it was I liken it to really that was the moment that started it all in terms of what I do now. Learning that opening phrase, the opening phrase that he's loved so bad, the very BB King thing. Because I remember we used to go to his studio for these guitar lessons, and they used to have these little amps in the corner. And I remember they were much better than anything I had at that point, but it was kind of these sort of nice little combo amps. And I remember sort of he would set them up. 'Cause I didn't know anything about any of that stuff, but he would dial in the right sounds, and he played that first phrase, and I was like, it was like that little light bulb going off in your head and thinking, okay, I know what I want to do now. Well, my granddad, really. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it was like blues in that sense, but it was definitely good music. Like it was, like obviously the Beatles. I've still got them now because he gave them to me, the whole Beatles collection. Obviously, that was huge for me, and I think it probably is for most musicians, is when you hear the Beatles for the first time. Uh, yeah, but like you say, to be totally honest, I really don't remember. I don't remember where, other than I was saying about Peter Green and that, but that was kind of already when I knew of, and I'd already been listening to it. I couldn't play it, but I'd been listening. Yeah, to be honest with you, and I know it's probably to some it might sound a bit insincere, but I really don't know. Um, it's just, I guess it's just one of those things. And like we were saying about that kind of, yeah, like they're one of those ethereal things. I think obviously it was just, I don't think it was a case of if it was going to happen. I think it was a case of when it was going to happen, and here I am now, so talking to you. So there we are. Yeah. Well, there's obviously like the hope and the want, isn't there? And then there's the reality. Who knows? Obviously I have like my own kind of desires, if you like, but I don't really talk about them very often because I'm sort of under the impression, it is what it is, isn't it? Really, to be honest, I'm sort of happy. Obviously, I'd love to do touring. There's obviously a few venues I'd love to play, and that's really just with the what I associate power of association. But generally speaking, as long as I'm out playing, recording, I was terrified about recording because the album, I mean, I did like an EP, but it wasn't. I don't know if you've heard the EP, but that was put out a couple of years. I don't know, 2 years ago, something like that. And I wasn't proud of it at all because there's a couple of tracks on the EP which we reworked and we rearranged and put on the album just because I really wasn't happy with them because I liked the songs. It's just obviously where my playing's changed and I wanted to kind of do them justice now. And I felt because they were written for an album, and just when they did them, I didn't know what that was. And then obviously now I know what it is. That's why they're there. Yeah, I really, really didn't take to recording to begin with, which is I don't know how unusual that is because I've always felt when I've heard people talk about their experiences with recording, they've always thought, oh yeah, no, it's like a great canvas. And it's kind of, I heard the Beatles kind of talk about that, like it's a great canvas you can kind of paint on, because obviously anything's possible, isn't it, in the studio, particularly nowadays with all the stuff that they've got. But no, I really, really didn't take to it to begin with. I found it really hard. And I think part of that is, even when I was doing the album, I think I definitely got better. Not that I'd done it since the EP, but I think maybe the mindset had changed slightly. And I think the thing that I really wrestled with is because I sort of pride myself on really being a big when we play live, like a big improviser. I don't really, and I'm not, obviously not alone in that, 'cause there's so many great improvisers, guitar players that I could never ever do anything like that. But that's what I tried to do. So to me, it was kind of the idea of that's the take you've got to live with, rather than sort of being able to kind of go back next Tuesday and do it again and it be different. Yeah, they totally are. Yeah, because yeah. Well, that's why. Yeah. Yeah, totally, and yeah, and that's exactly how I feel really, because like I said, it's a muscle, isn't it? You have to exercise, like improvising live and sort of being like, okay, well, I know how to improvise over, I don't know, let's say Spoonful. I know what to play. It's just doing it and kind of just, and also kind of letting yourself just be like, okay, well, I know what to do. It's hearing it up here and then hoping it comes out the right way. And I think the what I've learned, and this really is just by doing it, is I think it's just being like in the mindset of, okay, I'm good with the way this sounds. I like the way this sounds. This is the studio version. This isn't me doing it live. This is just the studio version. So absolutely, yeah, and yeah, it took a little bit of wrestling with, if I'm honest, to sort of to appreciate that. Because obviously, how would you appreciate it if you've never done it before? But yeah, I feel like I'm pretty good with it now. There's always that strive, obviously, to want to be better and, obviously get better as a musician. And then not another thing I found that's just as important at being a good musician in terms of your instrument, but it is also understanding what makes a sort of a great drummer or a great bass player. Because obviously working with, like I mentioned, Ray Drury earlier, because he sort of came in, because he plays with loads of bands. So we were very lucky to get him. And also, like I said, he plays with us live. 'Cause we just did the Bullfrog was it a couple of weeks ago, something like that. And he obviously came with to do it with us then, and we've got a couple more obviously with him. But but I remember going back to the studio. I remember sort of being sat there with him because obviously we rehearsed a little bit to go in to the studio because obviously you don't want to be like wasting time because it's like time is money and all that, isn't it? But we sort of worked on a few parts and all the rest of it. But I can remember me and Ray were sort of sat in the control room because obviously he had his stuff all wired into the desk or whatever. And I was sort of, because it's amazing what you hear after the fact. You'll hear it back and then go, not so sure about that, or let's try this. And I'd be working parts out with him. I mean, he's such a. I don't want to sort of make it sound like he, because he's phenomenal. He's very, very intuitive, and he sort of plays almost the right part at the right time. Excellent, excellent player. But it's just getting kind of, like I said earlier, it's like getting what's up here onto the thing, isn't it? That's the key to it. Yeah. But that's really all the insight I can give on the studio. I'm still learning as I go along, to be honest. But yeah, I've got to have a bit of a rest before that one. I'm not quite ready for that yet. Yeah. Well, well, like, me and Si, like I was mentioning, he's the bass player in the band, and we sort of talk about this, and it's kind of there's a few albums, I can't remember what they were he sort of was talking about, but you can tell they've been like a labour of love for like 2, 3 years, and then they get signed up to like a label or something like that, and then obviously they kind of try and fast track the process, don't they? And then you can tell that the second album is like, oh, this feels like it's been written in like a year rather than a couple, and it feels a bit rushed. Yeah, all quicker than that. Yeah, so yeah. I mean, I think again, because again, I think it was another conversation I had with. I think it was I can't remember who it was with. I probably had the conversation more than once, but it's that whole thing, isn't it, of that kind of, like you say, that regurgitation of maybe the same thing. And I think you have to be honest. And I think sometimes you can tell who the real fans are of, because I mean, you couldn't if you're not really a fan, but you're kind of aware that, let's talk about like the Beatles or Paul McCartney. I mean, you couldn't. I mean, I feel like kind of the social kind of almost thing that's imprinted into people if they're not really familiar with music is to be like, oh yeah, the Beatles, everything they did was perfect. But I think sometimes you can always tell who the real fans are of me. Not just, I'm not talking about just the Beatles, but of music. To go, yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. If we've talked about, I don't know, the Beatles or Paul McCartney or John Lennon or whatever it might be, I mean, I couldn't honestly, hand on heart, tell you everything that they did was perfect, because it wasn't, But and I'm sure part of that is just my opinion, but I feel like there is like a consistency to when they were on it, if that makes sense. Like when they knew exactly that was the right song. There's a consistency there in the quality of what you can tell is like the highs of their catalogue. Yeah. Oh, crikey. Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, if I mean, that's just kind of like I said, it comes out the 10th of April, and then obviously the album launches the same day. Yeah, so I think that's about it, really. I'm aware I don't want to take up any more of your time, because I'm sure your time is valuable. So